Great. Just one second. Okay, let's continue with the Gemara here on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph and move forward to Gimel Amud Beis. So what we've been discussing so far is the Gemara's discussion of the language of the Mishnah. Mishnah says that there are 15 women who potros tzoroseim v'tzaros tzoroseim mina chalitza umina yibum ad sof ha'olam. That there are 15 women if they are in the mix or candidates for yibum, meaning they were among the wives of the deceased brother. In other words, for example, as we've been saying, let's say you have two brothers, Reuven and Shimon, and Reuven marries Shimon's daughter, even though it's his brother, it's his niece, he's allowed to do that. And let's say Reuven has a second wife as well. So the presence of Shimon's daughter in the candidate pool of Yibum also disqualifies the other wife. That's the din, that if there are 15, any of these 15 ervas are excluded from Yibum and Chalitza, and they also exclude the co-wife as well. So the Gemara here on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, we spent a couple of weeks trying to analyze the principle of tzaras erva, meaning what is an erva, what is a tzaras erva? The erva is the daughter, let's say, who is married to the brother. She can't be a candidate for Yibum or Chalitza, but in addition to that, that's the argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. We paskin like Beis Hillel. According to Beis Hillel, the co-wife, the other wife who's not related in an additional way to the Yavam, is also excluded from Yibum, and we've been discussing why that is, like what's the basis of that. Good. So now we're up to Gimel Amud Aleph towards the down in the lower part of the page. So the Gemara says, "Umay area." This is 3, 6, 9 lines up from the bottom of the page. The Gemara says, "Umay area detani mina chalitza umina yibum." So in the Mishnah, it says that these 15 women are excluded from chalitza and yibum. And the question is the order, because normally wouldn't you say mina yibum or mina? Even if you had to say both, you'd say typically yibum and chalitza, because in the order of the parsha, in Parshas Kitetze, the first thing that we're told is ki yeshvu achim yachdav, when brothers live together, and then one of them, dies and he leaves no heirs. So what's the first thing we read about? Yibum, the obligation to, yavama yavo aleho lekachalo liisha. Then it says ve'im ma'ain yama'ain, if he refuses to do yibum, so then there's a second option of chalitza. But that is a second option. It's not the first option. And therefore, it's strange that in the Mishnah, we begin with chalitza and not with yibum. So that's what the Gemara is asking. My area detani mina chalitza umina yibum. First, the Gemara says, listening.
Like Abba Shaul, it makes sense, right?
Yeah, we're going to get that. The Gemara is going to introduce Abba Shaul for the first time right here in a minute. So the Gemara says, listening mina yibum lechudei. Why did you just say that there's an exclusion from yibum? That would be the right order. Look at Rashi. V'lisnim and ayibum l'chudei. The ikar mitzvah he the chalitza mimela mishtameya. So this is what Rashi says. It would have been better to say yibum because saying yibum is the main mitzvah, and that's the order of the psukim. And then we would understand that if there's no yibum, there's no chalitza either. Says the Gemara, itani mina yibum. If it only said that there's an exclusion of yibum, havamina mechlatz chalza, yivume lo miyabma, then you might have thought that even though there is no yibum, maybe there is chalitza. Why? So Rashi explains again, shalol hafkia mitzvah yibum. We don't want to completely exclude these women and their co-wives from the whole parsha of yibum. As we're going to see the limud in just a minute, the exclusion of tzaras erva is based on a pasuk litzror, and therefore, if there's kind of whether it's extended erva or whether it is that he becomes, reverts to the status of Eshes Ach Shalom B'Makom Mitzvahs Yibum. Either way, it's understandable, meaning there's a problem. You can't do the Yibum. The Yibum is a very sensitive, acutely hypersensitive, solution, and it requires, that everything be, Hidasu, everything be, perfectly in order. However, Kamash Milan Masnisin, that whole Patra Abbas Mizikas Hibum Ptura Minachalitza. The Kola Ola Lazikas Hibum Ola Lazikas Chalitza. Kol Shein Ola Lazikas Hibum Ptura Minachalitza. Kalecha Darmin Chaletzes for Lomis Yavemes Mishum Sveka Hava. So the basically what the Gemara is suggesting is that maybe if we had said minayibum, we would have thought that chalitza was possible, or either because it's a suffix, or because the problem is limited to having a physical relationship with an erva or an extended erva. So that's what it means. Itzana minayibum havamina miklat chalza yivume lo miyama kamash malan. Therefore, the conclusion to be reached is that there's no such compromise, at least on the Doraisa level. Meaning, whenever there is Zika, whenever there is the possibility of one, there's the possibility of the other. We'll have to examine whether it's true. That's the principle. Kola ola liyibum, ola lechalitza, kol she'ena ola liyibum, ena ola lechalitza. Now, later on, the Mishnah, if you look on the Mishnah daf, called Talmud Aleph, it does have cases of chalitza b'liyibum. That's what Rashi means. Those are either Safek or Midrabana. If you look on Chaf and Aleph, they've seen this Mishnah before. On 20a, Klal Amr B'Yavama, Kol Shi Isur Erva. If you're dealing with one of the Arayos, so the rule is Lo Choletzes V'Lo Misyavemes. Then this candidate is excluded from Yibam and from Chalitza. But if we're dealing with Isur Mitzvah V'Isur Kedusha, let's say a Chai Belavin, let's say a Grusha to a Kohen or an Almana to a Kohen Gadol or a Mamzeres. These are labin, but they're not chabikar, meaning they're less harsh punishments. The Kiddushin is tofes in these cases. So the Mishnah says, choletzes velo misyavemes. There is chalitza without yibum. So the Gemara later on originally the Gemara thought on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph that this is Minat Torah, that even from a biblical point of view, you can have cases of chalitza without cases of yibum. And then if you look carefully on the Gemara in Daf Chaf Amud Beis, if you turn the page, the Gemara says, no, it's not really true. The real reason that there's chalitza is because in principle there really is also yibum, but it would be a limited yibum, and therefore we prefer to avoid it. And therefore the Mishnah is telling you that on a rabbinic level, you should do chalitza without yibum. But Minat Torah, the principle that the Gemara establishes here on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, which is that whenever there's no yibum, there's no chalitza, meaning they go hand in hand, that there are two alternatives. And the common denominator, like, why do they go hand in hand? We'll discuss that in a minute. But the bigger idea of this connection is that in Minat Torah, you can't split these two from each other. Now, what is the reason for it? So, there could be, I'll just give you three options just very quickly. Number one is that maybe it's not the connection between Yibum and Chalitza per se, it's the common denominator that both share, and that is Zika. The Zika is the bond that is created by the mitzius, by the reality of the husband dying, not leaving any children. So that creates a Zika relationship. It creates a bond between the Yavam or the group of Yavamim and the group of Yavamas. There's more than one wife. And what the Gemara here is telling us about the relationship between Yibam and Chalitza is that's the common denominator. That's what it sounds like in Rashi. Meaning, if there's Zika, then there's Yibam. If it's a relationship that can't be consummated because there's something wrong, then that affects the Zika. And if there's no zika, there's no chalitza. So maybe all the Gemara means when it says that kol sheyeshna b'yibum yeshna b'chalitza, kol she'ena b'yibum ena b'chalitza, is not so much that the two are connected, as much as the common denominator between them, which is the zika, is a feature, which either is working or not working. If it working, then there should be yibum as well. If it's not working, there shouldn't be chalitza either. So it's not the connection of yibum and chalitza; it's what they share in common. That's one perspective. There's another perspective, and that is depending on how we look at chalitza itself. And this goes back to something that we spoke about in our introduction, especially we were talking about, what happens if a person takes an oath, right? And he says, I hereby swear that I will do neither yibum nor chalitza, right? So under those conditions, is that called nishba levatel mitzvah? Let's say he says, I won't do yibum, but I hold out the possibility of doing chalitza. Or let's say he says, I won't do chalitza, but I might do yibum. Is that nishba levatel mitzvah? So one of the things that we saw is that's one context, and I'll give you another context, and that is the Rishonim were trying to explain, whether or not you would make a bracha on chalitza. So some of them explained you can't make a bracha on chalitza. It's like a mitzvah ba'avera. It's like a, why? Because you really should be doing the yibum. And if you didn't do the yibum, then it's like a booby prize. It's like, a backup. That is, you have to, or a punishment almost. We discussed at the time, the phrase mitzvah ba'avera is a peculiar application here because it isn't really like a typical mitzvah ba'avera. The halachic principle of mitzvah ba'avera is classically a case of lulav agazel, right? Let's say you steal a lulav in order to accomplish the mitzvah of dalad minim on Sukkot. So can you fulfill a mitzvah by stealing in order to get the object of the mitzvah? So that's a principle that mitzvah ba'avera is not a proper, mitzvah. But that's the reason. That would be a reason why you don't make a bracha on chalitza, because the mitzvah ba'avera is not really a mitzvah ba'avera. You're supposed to do chalitza when you don't do yibum. So what do they mean by that? What they mean is that yibum and chalitza, this is the question, and it's a question in this context, bracha as well, and in our Gemara, and that is, what is the relationship between these two options? Because typically in the halakha, it's very rare to have two options. And when you do, like, there are different models. So when the Rishonim, the Tashbates and the Rivash were discussing, for them, they were talking about like, you can make Kiddush with wine, you can make Kiddush with pas, with bread. According to Rabbi Eliezer, when it comes to a typical Yom Tov, you could decide, O kula lashem, O kula lachem. You could decide, do I want to make it into a more of a gashmius oriented, a physical and material oriented Yom Tov, or more of a spiritual type Yom Tov? And here you have, do I want to do yibum? Do I want to do chalitza? So you could, in theory, there are different models. What I'm saying is, one way to look at it is, you have choice. You have two choices. You could do yibum, you could do chalitza. The other way, the opposite way to look at it is you're supposed to do yibum. If you don't do yibum, then the backup, the clear second choice, the b'di'evad, and it's almost maybe even like a punishment. That's probably what the Rishonim meant when they said you don't make a bracha because it's like a mitzvah ba'avera. What they meant was, they meant like lava nitak. The other example that they use, we discussed it at the time, is lava nitak laseh. Let's say you're supposed to eat the kudshim, the korban, on time, and you're not supposed to leave it over in the Beis Hamikdash. But if you do, then ba'esh tisrofu. You're supposed to burn it. So did anybody think you're going to make a bracha on the burning? That you're not supposed to leave it. But isn't
that even more pervasive, because you see what the woman says to the man
Yeah.
when you go through the process, that shame on you, so to speak. You didn't want to
Right,
build.
exactly. So it's even less than that. It's even worse than that in a way. So that's why we can understand what the Rishonim say. Again, not all of them agree. First of all, there's some who think you make a bracha, and others who think that there are other reasons why you don't make a bracha. But what I'm trying to say is getting back to our Gemara here on Gimel Amud Aleph just briefly. We'll talk about it more at another point. But the Gemara is saying that there's a principle. The principle is, well, Kola ola liyibum ola lachalitza. Kol she'ein ola liyibum ein ola lachalitza.
Yeah,
So,
but how do we resolve?
just one second. Just give me one more second. So what I'm saying is, so far I'm giving you two options. One is that it's not about the relationship of Yibam and Chalitza. It's about the common denominator of Zika. That's what it sounds like in Rashi. That's what Rashi says when he says that. Here, one second. Xeris hakosov kamashal masisin holu patra abbas mizikas yibum ptura min chalitza. Kola ola lezikas yibum ola lezikas chalitza. So by emphasizing the word zika here, right? What Rashi seems to be saying is that the common denominator is the zika. But the alternative to that is to say what I just said now, which is that you can't, if there's no obligation to do yibum, then maybe there is no shame, right? And you don't need to have a backup, to justify why you didn't do chalitza, right? Because even the language of the pasuk, imma'ain yima'ain, if he refuse, in some of these cases, he hasn't refused to do yibum. He can't do yibum. We won't let him do yibum, because there's an erva or there's a tzaras erva. So if there's an erva and a tzaras erva and he can't do yibum, why does he have to be humiliated? And why do we say that in ma'ain yima'ain, and you say beis chalutza now, kind of almost like a klala, like a curse, orur, almost like asher lo yivne, beis, okay, he doesn't have a choice. His hands are tied.
Is it
So
so
that's
clear?
not because of the common denominator of the Zika, but it is, what it's saying is that where you have the option of Yibum, so then the backup of Chalitza as a compensation makes sense. But if
Isn't
you
there a,
have a choice, so even if you have no choice, then maybe there's no Zika either.
so
Yeah.
isn't that the more fundamental question? Why would he have to say this whole terrible why would she have to say this whole terrible thing when he's not refusing out of will, he's refusing because he has no choice.
Right, that's what I'm just saying. So that's a second explanation. What I'm saying is it's a backup, almost like a but it isn't an equal backup.
But why don't we question the whole idea as to why he has to say it in a case like that? It's actually not a truthful statement.
No, but there's no chalitza at all in such a case. I mean, what I'm trying to explain is a bigger idea. Question is why, right? So the
But we
answer,
have cases
the
where
first
there are
answer was that there's no Zika. If there's no Zika for one, there's no Zika for the other. That's Rashi. The second answer is because the whole institution of chalitza is kind of a compensation, but like a criticism of him for not being miyabim. But you can't criticize him for not being miyabim if that's not a possibility.
But we have
You're
cases
asking something more limited. You're saying, and if you were to be cholates, maybe you shouldn't say the text. But
and we have a case like that. We have cases like that where the Rabbanan institute.
That's right.
And yet
That's
he
a
has
good
to do
Rabbanan.
the chalitza.
Right.
And
So I
yet,
think
the statement is
came
being
on,
said in that instance.
right. Those are Drabanan.
It's
That's what
even a
Rashi
non-truthful statement. It's not that he didn't want to.
but
Rabbanan didn't let him.
okay, I hear it. But either way, Midat Torah, the point is there is Yibum. There is like an objective b'diavad situation here, even though it was imposed upon him rather than being his choice. That's true.
By the way, there's also a Deraisa case. If the woman refuses, right, he still has to give a chalitza. And she's still going to say that
I guess
about him. I mean, the poor guy,
that's worse in a way.
He was refused. He wanted to do it.
In a way that's more egregious. Right.
Yeah.
The Chazan had a question before.
Rabbi, may I ask something?
Yeah, just
I
one more
understood.
second. First the Chazan, and then I'll ask you as well. But I think he had his
In
hand up
that
before.
case, that we have the Shakla and Tarya on what's first, Yibum and Chalitza. How do we resolve the Gemara? There is an opinion the Gemara, but it says first Chalitza and then Yibum.
No, that's the
makes
next line of the Gemara.
What?
That's going to be the next line in the Gemara. So
okay.
just hold off on that. Yeah, you had a
Well,
question, Stephen?
This is my, yes, thank you. This is my question. From 8 years ago, when we used to study this together, or 10 years, it's called Yibum Halitza. And
Yibum?
Yibum the Vav. My point is, I would like to ask you your opinion of that relationship of the Vav to the next statement. Meaning it's called Yibum Halitza. You know, I'm not talking about the gematria of 207 and Ein Sof with the Vav. I'm only talking about it from a rabbinic point of view. That
Right.
Vav must mean something, because for me, the Vav connotates the rabbinical Halitza being higher than the Yibum.
Well,
And so
in general order, the order of first of all, it's a good question. The order of the Vav is actually, there is mixed evidence in rabbinic literature. You know,
Right,
I'll give
that's
you
what I'm asking.
another example of it. Like people say, you know, they say Yafeh, Torah, you know, Im. It's a similar problem. Im derech, which is
Priya
Ikar and which is Tafel.
Yeah.
Right. So there is that question. But here, as I say, we're going to see in the next line that there actually is a debate, and that some people think chalitza is preferable. Exactly. So what you're asking about,
Right.
you know, chalitza possibly being is very similar to what Chazan was asking a second ago, but that is actually the next line of the Gemara. So we're going to.
Thank you.
It shows that everybody is, you know, not only on top of it, but like, you know,
Ahead of it.
attuned to the rabbinic thinking here, which is the best. Okay. So the Gemara says, anyway,
Where
so this
exactly
just
are
to
we
come
on the
back to it for a
Gemara,
minute.
Rabbi? Where are we
Yeah.
exactly on the Gemara? Where are we on the Gemara exactly?
We are on the bottom of Gimel Amud Aleph.
Okay.
Inami min chalitza lechuda. That's what we're about to read.
Okay.
Right. The Gemara says, "Velisni min yibum min chalitza." Why don't you say both? And say the order of, and we're all talking about the language of the Mishnah. Like the Mishnah says that and any of the 15 arayos are potros tsarosayim, vitzaros tsarosayim, mina chalitza mina yibum. So the Gemara wanted to know, why don't you say yibum v'chalitza in the other order? That's exactly the question that you guys are all asking, whether it's through the vav or through, right. So the listening mina yibum and mina chalitza, Inami mina chalitza lechuda, or just say that there's no chalitza, then everybody will figure out if there's no chalitza, there's certainly no yibum. So here's where the Gemara, I think Jacob also mentioned this. Here's where the Gemara, for the first time, it's not the main source, we'll see in a moment, brings in the position of Abba Shaul. Abba Shaul has a very exacting standard for Yibum. This is really very important. What does Abba Shaul say? But well, first of all, for our Gemara's purposes, they don't quote the full Abba Shaul. But look at Rashi for a minute. On the second line before the bottom of the page, Abba Shaul who? The Perikacholates. Rashi says, look on Lamed Tesam base, which we're going to do in a minute. Abba Shaul Omer Akones Yivimto L'shum Noi L'shum Ishus Ki'ilu Pogea Be'erva the carved the Einai Leos Havlad Mamzer. Wow. So what that's we'll see in the Gemara in just a minute. But what Abba Shaul says is that if a person goes into or is motivated to do Yibum, not out of a sense of duty and out of the sense of the legacy and continuity for his brother, but because he's infatuated with the beauty of the candidate, right? Or maybe he always wanted to marry her, you know, and you know the brother beat him to it, you know, or whatever. says the Abba Shol, this is just very remarkable, that if the motivation is not, pure and exclusively connected to the obligation, to the family obligation, and to the legacy of the brother, listen to the language, it's ki'ilu pogea be'erva. It's as if we have encountered erva, meaning an illicit relationship, right? Remember, it would have been an illicit relationship because it's your brother's wife. But the reason that it's permissible and obligatory in a mitzvah is because he left no children, and this is the mitzvah of Yibum. So in a way, what Abba Shol is saying is this whole enterprise of Yibum is hanging by a thread, meaning it has to be done perfectly in order to extricate yourself from the regular din.
In a way, isn't Abba Shaul pretty much answering the question? It's very rare that the Torah tells you so specifically why you have to do something.
Almost never.
Right.
This is one of the most extreme, being the idea of having lishma, and such an extreme lishma.
So maybe what Abba Shaul is
Very-
saying is that the reason that the Torah is saying this is that the only reason you're able to transgress this obvious error
Right,
is for this particular reason.
right,
And if
right,
in any
right.
way you don't keep this precisely, it's not just like not having the right kavanah. You have not done what you're allowed to do to the exclusion, and therefore
Right. You haven't
therefore
extricated yourself.
your permissibility disappears, and therefore you are doing what Abba Shaul claims. You are having a relationship with an erva, and therefore the children are mamzerim. So it's not as far-fetched when you think about it.
No, it's not far-fetched. It's just very remarkable because it's very, first of all, we don't, I should mention, again, maybe we'll speak more about Abba Shaul another time, but just to let you know a couple of the range, it is very remarkable, number one, because where we find, even if you have to have the right intention in terms of knowing what you're doing, but the idea that motivation, that your purpose is pure, that's always a good thing. But the idea that would be unnecessary, normally we say about, studying Torah and fulfilling mitzvos, mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma,
Yeah, but here we have a specific instruction.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree. So the Rambam, what you're saying is is the Rambam in maybe I'll bring some of the Makoros for next time, but the Rambam in his Perashah Mishnayos, in his commentary on the Mishnah, but not in Yevamos, strangely, but in Masechet Bechoros. There's a Mishnah in Bechoros that speaks about the relationship between Yibum and Chalitza, because they're talking about also, a rifas, chamor and pidyon beseh. So the Mishnah compares the two. In the Rambam's commentary on that Mishnah, and again in a responsum that he wrote, a tshuva of the Rambam, in both cases, he characterizes the position of Abba Shaul very closely to what you just said, meaning that it's a kind of a dechuya, meaning that, you start off, the default is that you are, playing with fire, meaning that this is eshes achicha, and, that remains prohibited even after he dies and doesn't leave any children. The only time you have the chiyuv or the mitzvah, or the only time you can implement the mitzvah, is then if you do it, exactly, the right way. The Rambam himself says we don't paskin like Abba Shaul. And in Yad HaChazaka, the Rambam doesn't paskin like Abba Shaul. However, it should be noted that some of the Balei Tosas do paskin like Abba Shaul.
But the Sfardim
Tam.
continue to do Yibum. The Sfardim did continue to do Yibum.
Yeah, for that reason, we'll see in a moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I also should add on the other side of it that there were others like the Nimukei Yosef and the Ritva who were so convinced that this, cannot be because it's just such a high standard,
And no one can live up to it.
that they basically said that the din of Abba Shaul is a din d'Rabbanan, not a din d'Oraisa, and that it's, it's a rabbinic requirement, not a not a biblical one.
Why do we have to worry about the erva altogether? Because
Well, so it says hare ki'ilu, it's
Yeah.
like,
right.
and it says, and again, the mamzer, it doesn't say there's actually erva and mamzer. No one I'm aware, even Balitosis don't think there's actually mamzerin. They just think that but this is a very severe language. Now, I have a bit of a different take in all this, but it's not contradictory to what we just said. But it's what I've been saying all along. And that is that, in addition to the technical point, which is, which is what you're saying, what the Rambam says in those places, you have to kind of overcome the regular Eshesach, even if the objective circumstances are that, that the brother died and there are no heirs, and therefore on the docket is the mitzvah of Yibum. You still, it's still, if it's not done perfectly right, you're going to fall back into Eshesach. But I think there's more than that, and that is potentially more than that, and that is that what I've been saying all along, which is that even if it was Hutra, right, what makes it Hutra is this proper motivation. Because it's not, you don't have to say that what the Torah is telling us, either on a Dechuya or a Hutra level, is that, the overriding effect or the consequence of, producing a child for this dead brother, allows you to violate, or allows you, is a different circumstances, and therefore there's no Isur of Eshesach. What you might say is, if you fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum b'kedusha, then it represents the height of Ishus. But for that reason, and this is something I've been saying all along, there's a tremendous kula in every Yibum, because you're overriding the Isur of Eshesach. But there's also tremendous chumrah, and that is, you have to do it, in the right way. And there's greater sensitivity in Yibum to make sure that you're not just, getting away with an Isur, but that on the contrary, it's all kiyesh v'achim yachdav. It's not that you're betraying your brother in order to give him a legacy. It's that since you're trying to give him a legacy, that's not a betrayal. That is an act of loyalty and sanctity. In other words, if you had a relationship with your brother's wife in other circumstances, that would be horrific, because not only is it usher, but it's obviously
it may explain the situation with Tamar. If you think about it, they had, for other reasons, the opposite reasons, the wrong intentions in the Yibum relationship. But the fact that they were chayav misa for that act, if you think about it, that's a pretty harsh punishment. But if it's an error of that type, then the punishment would be appropriate, because doing such an act is chayav misa.
Right.
So it may explain.
It's a good point. Anyways, if you look at the Gemara in Lamed Tessamid Beis, so this is the din of Abba Shaul. If you look here just for a minute, that's the main Gemara that Rashi is quoting. Here it's on Lamed Tessamid Beis, 39b.
1 second, please.
Lamed Tessamid Beis. It's towards the bottom of the page. If you look at the bottom of the page, on Lamed Tessamid Beis, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, about 10 or so lines up from the bottom of the page, on Lamed Tessamid Beis, the Gemara says,
Abba Shaul Omer,
Abba Shaul Omer, Hakones Esivimto, if a person consummates a Yibum, L'Shem Noi, but he's motivated, by her physical appearance, right? Ulashem Ishus. L'Shem Ishus means like, he always, wanted, or he just thinks she'll be a good wife. I mean, not because he's not trying to do it for the brother, he's doing it, for his own reasons, right? This falls into his, this opportunity, right? Ulashum davar acher, or some other
financial or whatever.
Well, it could be finance, exactly. In other places we have like exactly. So the rule is ki'ilu pogea be'erva. It's the equivalent of encountering an illicit relationship. V'karov ani be'enai. You notice you see it's ki'ilu and it's karov ani be'enai, and it's pretty, from my point of view, says Abba Shaul, it's close to, right? Leos havlad mamzer. Wow, that's an amazing thing. Anyway, because of Abba Shaul's position, going back now to Gimel Amud Aleph, so the Gemara says, Abba Shaul hu da'amar mitzvahs chalitza kodemes lemitzvahs hibum. And that's what both of you or all three of you were saying. And that is that Abba Shaul was of the opinion that the chalitza is preferable to the ibum because of, not because inherently it's preferable, but because there's a recognition, that for most, flawed, human beings, being able to muster, the righteous, we'll call it, purist, lishma or kavana is very difficult. And
So
since
the
stakes are great and you're kind of courting erva and mamzer, so Abba Shaul would prefer that you play it safe and you go the route of chalitza, but he can't eliminate yibum because yibum is impossible. And it's clear in the Psukim that Yibum is preferable to Chalitza, but the din of Abba Shaul is a policy matter. It means what we tell people to do is Chalitza, because we're not confident across the board, that people will do Yibum in the proper way.
According to Abba Shaul, if we take it to the extreme, here's somebody who's willing to do this yibum to bring up the name of his brother, but he's also attracted to the woman. So the poor guy at that point has to do chalitza. He has to be called a bad person and everything because he was more than willing to do this for the sake of his brother, but she happens to be an attractive, whatever the reason is, okay? Or maybe she's a wealthy woman.
Could be attractive.
He's very happy that he's going to get money out of it also. But that wasn't his initial motive. But according to Abba Shaul, that still would make it that he has to do chalitza.
Only if it's to be fair, only if he can't really know or separate, those things from each other, which is very difficult. Don't get me wrong. But it's not that if there are those elements that's a pagam, that disqualifies. It's just you have to make sure it isn't. That's not the motivating factor.
One of the point of fact at this point in Gimel Amud Aleph, has the Gemara reached the conclusion yet that if there's no yibum, there can't be chalitza, that they're attached to each other?
Yes, that's the previous line. That's what we were explaining in the previous line.
So therefore,
why do
we have to say yibum and chalitza patros? Why don't we just say yibum patros with no chalitza?
No, because the Gemara asked a different question. The Gemara said, fine, maybe they're connected, but in the language of the Mishnah, why don't you say mina yibum and mina chalitza, or just say mina chalitza?
So we know what one would tell us the other. We know this by now at this point.
Right. But which one? So the Gemara said what you just said earlier. The Gemara says
because there's a whole shakla somewhere here, if I remember way back when, as to the issue that if you can't have yibum, you can't have chalitza.
No, it's the previous line in the Gemara. Yeah. That's what we just read. The Gemara says, "Itani mina yibum havamina mechlatz chalza yibum elo miyabma kamash malan kala ola liyibum ola lechalitza kol she'en ola liyibum en ola lechalitza." But then the Gemara says that's fine, but there's a way out of that. And that is velisni mina yibum umina chalitza. But either way, shouldn't the order in the Mishnah be that you're excluded mina yibum mina chalitza? Why does it say mina chalitza mina yibum? So now the Gemara is trying to explain the reason it says mina chalitza mina yibum is because Abba Shaul thinks that chalitza is preferable. So that's the one that you mentioned first, like we were saying before. Which is the one that you mentioned first, or which is the one you mentioned second? So he's saying, chalitza is more preferable, and therefore what we're saying is don't do chalitza. Also, don't do yibum. But
everybody agrees if you can't do one, you can't do the other.
Yes, that's what we said in the previous line. On a Doraisa level, Minatora.
That's what I wanted to ask: is does Abba Shaul regard his opinion as a midoraisa or midrabanan?
So that I think I mentioned before, the Rambam and the Ramban and others certainly hold that it's minat Torah, but the Ritva and the Nimukei Yosef disagree. They think it's only midrabana. And most people don't paskin like Abba Shaul, like the Rambam, the Ramban. Many of them do not paskin like Abba Shaul, but some of the Balei Tosas, including Rabbeinu Tam, did paskin like Abba Shaul.
Isn't this an Ashkenaz Sfarad dichotomy?
No, it's not, but it's not across the board. But almost all the Rishonim, even in Ashkenaz, most of them paskined against Abba Shaul, which is that's good because it's very hard. I mean, but I will say something else. What some Rishonim say, which is, even if you don't paskin like Abba Shaul, that doesn't mean that the sensibility of Abba Shaul is incorrect. And that's important for what I was trying to say. Meaning, it may not be, we're not going to go so far as to say that we won't allow Yibum, unless you have totally
aspirational
pure motivation. But the idea that you want to eliminate as much as possible anything that, smacks of erva. So, for example, when I was trying to explain last week and the week before why it is that Saras Erva, is only in the context of Yibum. So we have two explanations for that. But if we think that there's a category called Saras Erva, meaning that not only is the Erva excluded, but even the wife, the co-wife who's just associated with Erva is also excluded, why is that only in Yibum? But what I was trying to explain was because Yibum is a hypersensitive idea. And where do you get that from? From Abba Shaul. Let's say you don't paskin like Abba Shaul. You don't have to paskin like Abba Shaul to understand that what he's saying needs to be addressed, if not on the level of B'diavad, at least on the level of...
A little bit like Rabbi Akiva's position on Gittin, on what level a person has to be at, or he has to divorce his wife.
Right. Right. In other words, there are certain things.
Words, it's an almost impossible level also that he's
but these are ideals. So even if we don't accept them 100%, there are things to... Right.
Rabbi, may I ask about that Vav? Because from what you're saying, how about if it's like a Vav Hahipuk, where it changes the positioning of it? Because it's coming after the Vav, but it's a Hahipuk, it's really before the Yibum. It's really higher than the Yibum.
No.
Because of the Vav.
That's not what
Vav. I hear it, but you have to understand that the word Yibum v'chalitza or chalitza v'yibum, these are only in rabbinic sources. That phrase is only in rabbinic sources. We don't have that in any of the verses.
I understand, but the Rambam calls his entire section of all this, of the whole thing, Yibum v'chalitza.
Right, but that's again because he passed. That goes to what I was saying before, which is he rules against Abba Shaul, and therefore he thinks that the Yibum is preferable. So he's actually putting in his order is what's best, and what's what's second best.
Fine, so thank you. Yibum, that's good enough for me. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, great. So let's continue.
I'm looking at the very bottom of Gimel Amud Aleph.
We're going to get the next line now.
At the Tosfos. The mitzvahs chalitza kodemes.
Right.
Can I ask you to spend half a minute to explain what really Tosfos talks here? Is it consistent with the other opinion, or how does it work?
Mitzvahs chalitza kodemes. 1 second. Hashta dikatani travayu, b'shona chalitza bereisha. Mashma chalitza kodemes. He says he's trying to explain the language of the Gemara. The Gemara wanted to know how come in the Mishnah it says chalitza first, even though, as we noted, usually, and in the Rambam and so on, we say yibum v'chalitza, but the Mishnah said chalitza. So the Gemara says that that's because the Mishnah is according to Abba Shaul, who thinks that chalitza is prior. So that's what these words mean. Hashta dekatani travayu, since it mentions both yibum and chalitza, the shona chalitza bereisha, but chalitza is mentioned first. Mashma de chalitza kodemes. It would appear that it is preferable. Aval ilo havatani ela chalitza lechudei, says Tosas, If we only
Yes.
said Pater min chalitza and we didn't mention Yibum at all, lo havamash mimidi, then there might have been another reason why we emphasize chalitza, not the fact that it is preferable. But
Thank
again,
you.
just to make it clear, the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, almost most of the Rishonim are the opinion that Yibum is kodem lechalitza. Bisman hazeh, we don't usually, do a Yibum anyway. We do, but the Balitosis hold even in a more fundamental way that chalitza is preferable. Okay, let's continue in the Gemara. So then the Gemara says, Minyana de Reisha lamute mai, Minyana de Seifa lamute mai. This is the last line on Gimel Amud Aleph. We're moving forward. So the Gemara wants to know how come the Mishnah says our 15 arayos, ervas.
We lost you, Rabbi. Okay. We lost the Rabbi. Andy, I can see you, but
Yeah, very strange.
Maybe his Wi-Fi connection. Something happened to his Wi-Fi connection.
maybe somebody should call him. I don't have his number. I think he doesn't know even.
Can everybody hear me and see me? I don't know why my computer turned itself off.
We can now hear you for the first time, but we
can
can't
hear
see
you.
We can hear you.
You can hear
We
me.
can
Okay,
hear
great.
you, Rabbi, but we cannot see you. I cannot see
Okay.
you.
Let me try to.
That's okay. We hear you is more important.
Okay, I don't know why I got it. I think I can fix that. Okay, you can see me now too?
Yes,
Yes.
we do.
Yeah.
Okay, great. For some reason, I had to sweat. For some reason, my computer restarted, not without instructions, but these are things that just happen apparently. Okay, so let's continue. So the Mishnah wants to know why it is that it's necessary to count 15 when we all know how to count. The Mishnah could have said these are the Erevas, and then it's just like in the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbos
39 malachim.
with 39 malachos, they say, like, limuta, what's the point of it? So anyways, so the Gemara says that it's meant limute to exclude the Rav Ravasi. What are Rav and Ravasi? This is something we spoke about last week for a different reason, and that is Rav and Ravasi were of the opinion that there's also a couple of other cases. For example, Sota and Tzara Sota. That's what Rashi explains. Look at Rashi on the top of Gimel Amud Beis. Damarav Tzara Sota Asura. The co-wife of a Sota is also prohibited. This is something we spoke about last week. What's the case? Let's say Reuven is married to two women, and one of the women betrayed him. She, betrayed her marriage vow. So she becomes a Sota. Let's say then, before there was a divorce, let's say Reuven dies, and now this woman and another co-wife who is perfectly loyal are now candidates for Yibum. So that's what these words mean. Sara Sota Asura, Shimzinsa Ishta below Isha Acheres, Umes below Banim, Shtehen Peturos. So, just 1 second. Just going to try to get back on the computer if I can, because it's a little easier. But we'll see if I can do that. Yes. So the case is whether when there are two candidates for Yibum, one is a Sota and the other is, a wife who was perfectly proper in her behavior. So as Rashi explains, below Isha Cheres, a mace below Banim, Shteim Peturos. According to Rav, that too is the equivalent of erva, even though it isn't really an erva because Sota is not chayve krisos. But nonetheless, this woman and her co-wife will be excluded as well. And the Mishnah wants you to know that that is not true. Meaning, from the Mishnah's point of view, Saras Sota is not a case which is excluded from Yibum and from Chalitza. That's one case. The other case is Rav Asi. What is Rav Asi? Rasi Amar Saras Islandis Asura. What does that mean? Shim Haya Nasui Islandis. Let's say a person is, Ruvain is married to a woman who doesn't have the capacity to have a child, meaning she doesn't have the ability to bear children. And he's also married to another woman. He is married to two wives, one who has the capacity to bear children, and the other one, does not. So the question is, the one who is an islandess is certainly not a candidate for Yibum and for Chalitza, because the whole point of Yibum is what?
With children.
Exactly. So you can't have lahakim, zera la'achiv, or shame la'achiv if the woman doesn't have. But what about her co-wife? Right? Is that also going to be a problem or not? So that is the chiddush of Rav Asi. That's the chiddush of Rav Asi. Rav Asi says that the tzara of an islandess is also excluded. Now here,
how does Rav Asi explain why the Mishnah doesn't include it?
No, so that's the point. Our Mishnah is against Rav, and it's against Rav Asi. That's all. So
Rav, I can understand, because Rav can argue with the Mishnah, maybe, but Rav Asi can't.
Okay, I don't know. Rav Asi said Salas Irenis is Asura. One second. Sheim Nasi Islands Vishacheres Meis Belabanim Stem Pturas of Travayu Bepirkin. But I should just mention that there's an issue in the case of Tsaras. One second. In the case of Tsaras Sota, at least you have the woman herself is off limits to the first husband, as we discussed last week. And therefore the possibility, and then the Gemara says that when it comes to Sota, Tuma is Ke'erva. And therefore that excludes, not only the Sota, but her co-wives, as well. But when it comes to Tsaras Islandess, that seems to be, a problem of a different proportion. There's no erva in islandess, right?
But there's no.
One second. I'm gonna. One second.
Oh, okay. What happened? Oops. We lost Rabbi Rosensweig.
Yeah.
Okay, can everybody hear?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, much better.
Yeah, you're back. But
Yeah.
It's
now
better
we
this way,
lost,
right?
now we lost you again. Oh no, there you are.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
But in the case of the islands, the Patur of Hakim Shem Achib disappears, so that puts you back into the Erba position.
How so? Because it puts you back.
You lost your Patur. The whole Patur was Hakim Shem Achib, so you're back to the original Erba. So
right, so exactly. So this is what I wanted to point out, and that is that when it came to the Tsaras Erva of an actual Erva, we had two ways to explain why the co-wife might be excluded as well. And the way Rashi understood it was that as long as there's no Zika on all of the wives, there's also going to be everybody's going to revert back to Eshes Ach Shelo B'Makom Mitzvah Siba. So in the case of idleness, there's no erva, because no one did anything wrong. There's no illicit relationship. He was allowed to be married to her. This brother could marry her. Like, just because she can't produce children doesn't mean you can't marry her, Khalila. So that's not the problem. But the problem is there's no Zika Liyibum because she can't produce children. And if there's no Zika Liyibum for one, there's no Zika Liyibum for the others. That would be the mentality. And therefore, everybody becomes an Eshes Achiv, right? Shelo Haya B'Makom Yibum. Why does the Mishnah, the author of the Mishnah, disagree with this? Probably because they think that there is no tziruf, there's no way to, you don't have to look at these wives together. In other words, if you have childbearing wives, then we look at them as a unit, and we say that either the zika for all or the zika for none. And if there's zika for none, then you get into the problem of tsaras er. However, if one of them is an islandess, right, then that person isn't even, maybe the mentality of the Mishnah is that person isn't even a candidate. And if they're not a candidate, then the candidates that are viable are not affected by the candidate that is fundamentally excluded. And therefore, what we will say is that there's no tsaras, the others don't lose their status as candidates for Yibum because of the presence of the islandess, if you disagree with Ravasi, because the islandess is so excluded because it's a physical impediment that she's just not, it never was in the original Zika. But she doesn't drag down the group, right, by virtue of her exclusion. Anyways, that's the
And at the end, do we have to give chalitza to these women or not?
so that is we'll discuss that when we get to Daf Yud Aleph. We'll discuss that whether la halacha tsaras erva is a problem. And tsaras erva and tsaras max grushaso we think is a problem. Tsaras islandess, I believe, I think we don't paskin that way. Yeah. So the Gemara says lemute de Rab and de Ravasi. The Gemara says l'Rav l'Ravasi lemute mai. According to them, what does the Mishnah exclude? So because I have to wait to read the Mishnah, as you noted. So the Gemara says, Isfir lahu dahadadi, then chada lemute tzaras mima enes, v'chada lemute tzaras machzir grushal. So there are two other cases. I'm not going to go into them right now. One is tzaras mima enes, and mima enes is a case where a person is married to a child, but it's the child is only a nisuin d'Rabbanan because the father, is no longer alive. The brother and the mother basically married her off, and they don't have the right to do that min Torah. So she, when she comes of age, has the right to opt out of this marriage. That's called a mima'enes. So the question is, if you have a mima'enes, what impact does that have on the co-wives? Because again, it's a situation where one of what looked like the wives, right, is no longer a viable Yibum candidate. So that's one case. And the other case is Tsaras Machzir Grushaso. Machzir Grushaso is a very interesting case that we discussed last year, and I mentioned it also last week. And that is a person is married, he has two wives. Let's say one of them he divorces, and then she remarries. So when she remarries, he's not allowed to marry her again, even after she gets divorced from the other husband. He can't go back to marrying her. However, if he does, b'diavad, the kedushin is chal. So let's say illegally, right? He remarried his wife, his divorced wife, that he wasn't supposed to remarry. So the question is she excluded from Yibum and Chalitza? And is the tsara, if there's a co-wife, would that woman also be excluded from Yibum?
The case where he remarries her while the kedushin is kal, however, the relationship is at least allowed, no?
Yeah, it's very similar. The Gemara also there uses the expression that it's tuma ke'erva.
Yeah, so the point is, if the brother would step into the shoes of his dead brother and have a relationship with this woman, it would not only be Eishes Ach, it would be a second thing, and maybe that's not enough.
Well, it's only going to be Eishes Ach if there's an impediment because of the Chayve Laban. Now, normally Chayve Laban, we say...
Even takes away the Eishes Ach, but does it take away the second problem? And that is,
yeah, but remember, you have to understand that normally when it comes to Sota and Machzir Grushaso, you would think that you say Ase Dochalos Ase, and therefore there would be Yibum.
But now you have two Losases.
Not really. Why do you have two
Every
Osase?
time he's living with her, even though he had a right, the Kedushin is valid, forget Rabbi
Right.
Akiva, who would
That's
have
the
hysterics,
lav.
would have hysterics about this. But the point of the matter is that,
But that's only one lav.
but
Why
every,
is it two lav?
first law is that the Yibum takes over is Eishazach.
No. You never count the Eishes Ach as a second lav for purposes of Ase Dochalos Ase in Yibum because your deal. That's exactly what Yibum is. You're saying Ase Docha, Los Ase. We'll get to
Yibum,
that.
so Yibum is not the concept of Esadocha. Also say when
So that's a debate between the Balei Tosis and the Ramban, and we're going to see that next week. But let's assume for the moment not. Okay, so let's continue in the Gemara. So then the Gemara, we're going to have to stop in a couple of minutes, but we have a few more minutes. So the Gemara says this will set us up for next week. So now the Gemara says the following. Minohanimil, I'm going to skip a couple of words because we basically are there. The Gemara says Minohanimili. How do we know this halacha? Which halacha? So far we've been speaking about the din of tsaras erva, the co-wife of an erva. Look at Rashi for a minute. Rashi says Minohanimili. The erva v'tzarasa liolam beturos. How do we know that an erva and the tsaras erva and the tsaras erva, how do we know that all of these are excluded from Yibum and Chalitza?
it says so in the Mishnah.
No, the Mishnah said, but how does the Mishnah know it?
Oh, okay.
What's the source, right? So the Mishnah is telling us a fact, but where did the Mishnah get it from? It has to come from somewhere. So the Gemara says the Tanur Abanan, Isha el Achosa. This is referring to in the parsha of Arayos and Achremos. This is the wife's sister. Okay, the wife's sister, meaning the other sister-in-law, not the wife of your brother, but the
one that's not subject to Yibum.
The sister of your wife. So achos isha, in that context, it says isha el achosa. You can't have a relationship with a woman and her sister, meaning once you are married to someone, the sister of your wife is off limits. Lo tikach, meaning you can't be involved with her. Litzror, the word litzror is the source for tzaras erva. Litzror legalo servasa aleha bechayah. So the Gemara says, Aleha ma Talmud lomar. The word Aleha is superfluous. It could have just said, Lotzikach litzror legalo servasa. Why does the extra word Aleha? So the answer is, Lefisha Nemar Yavamo Yavo Aleha. Because in Parshas Kitetse, the first pasuk is in Achremos. But the way drashos work, the hypersensitivity of the language of the Torah to divine text. So we're saying the word Aleha appears superfluously in Parshas Achremos in the context of erva, and the same word appears Yavamo Yavo Aleha. So the drasha is as follows: Shomean. So the drasha is that in the context of Aleha, of Yibum, there's a prohibition of achos ishto, and not only that, but litzror, also the tzara of achos ishto. Achos ishto and tzara are both excluded even in an aleha context, meaning a yibum context.
Doesn't the word b'chayeha defeat everything?
No, b'chayeha is there to teach you the limitation.
Yeah, but since that limitation
on achos
you can't
ishto, because I
split
think I mentioned, Ariel Sharon a couple of times.
but you can't split
His second wife, I think Lily was her name, was the sister of his first wife, but after his first wife died.
But if you want to use the sort of the Gezerah Shava, but you're using it from a situation that is exactly opposite of what you're trying to do here. Because if we applied the B'chayeha to the Yibum issue, we wouldn't have the problem in the first place.
Right, because the main pasuk, you have to understand, the main pasuk in Achremos is just about erva, nothing to do with Yibum. This is the source.
But it's a limited b'chayeho in the case of the sister.
Yeah, but since it says the extra word aleha, so we're supposed to
So we're
you know,
going to ignore the
connect that.
Bechayela fact and we're just focusing on the Gzera Shava of Allah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So lefishanemer yavama yavoleha shomei ani afilu ba'achas mikol arayos v'amuros batorah kosim there. So you might think this is very fascinating. The Gemara is saying, like, how do you know that arayos? Forget about tzaras erva. Before you get to tzaras erva, how do you know the erva cannot be misyavemes? Right? Because after all, and you would say, the way you would say it, and the way they are saying it, is every yibum is already is overriding an erva, right? Eshasach. So why not override
You have
two
a
ervas?
pasuk that tells you to do Yibum. Well, I don't understand the question.
No, so the Gemara is just asking, like, how do you know? If not for the word aleha, we wouldn't have known. We would have thought that achos ish, just like eshasach, you do yibum lahakim lahachiv shem. So too, another erva you'll do lahakim lahachiv shem. Now, would they have thought that about bito or emo? I don't think so. But at least achos ishto, or maybe maybe chamaso, or maybe Eshes Aviv, which isn't a blood relate. When there are no blood relations, how do you know that that there's no yibum there too? Meaning, if the urgency of lahakim laachiv is great enough to set aside one erva, maybe it sets aside two ervas. Therefore, nemar kan aleha, the nemar lahalon. This is the drasha aleha, right? Ma lahalon b'moko mitzvah. Just as aleha means yibum, and still in Achremos, when they say Aleph, if it refers to Yibum, it means there's still an Isser of Achos Ishto. Avkan b'makom mitzvah, the Rachmana lo tikach. So that is the source. Now, what's going to happen in a few minutes is that the Gemara, or next time when we pick up with this, the Gemara is going to say, well, do you really need a source to teach me this? What would be the reason to allow Yibum, even though there was an Erev? The mitzvah, right? The principle of Aseh Docha Los Aseh, that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. Says the Gemara later on, we're going to see this in a moment. I'll read it actually, but let me finish this line first. The Gemara says, Ainli Elahi, maybe this is only the Erev was excluded. Tsarasa minayin. How do you know the co-wife is excluded? We spent so much time talking about this, but this is the Gemara that brings the source. Talmud Lomar litzror. Litzror meaning even is a reference to the tsara, to the rival. The Einli Ela Tsarasa minayin. How do you know even the tsara of a tsara? Talmud Lomar litzror v'lo latzur. Okay. Then the Gemara says, Einli Ela achos isha.
What difference does it make? Tzror or tzur, what's the difference?
No, they're trying to show that even if it's one step more removed, the tzara of a tzara, never mind the tzara of an erva. So that's why the Torah uses the word litzror to say even a tzara of a tzara. It's like it's like a remez. So the Gemara says maybe this is only achos isha, but maybe other arayos there would be yibum. Shar arayos minayin. So the Gemara says amris ma achos isha muyucheda she erva v'chayav and alez donat pares val shigos achatos v'asur liyavim of kol she erva v'chayav and alez donat pares val shigos achatos asura liyavim. Meaning, not only achos ishto is prohibited from yibum, but any of the ervas, separate from, of course, eshes ach, which is what yibum is, but any of the others would also be an impediment to yibum. Then the Gemara says, Ein li elahein, tsaroseim minayan. How do you know even the tsaros of the other ervas? Let's say tsaras bito, or tsaras chomiv. Maybe it's only tsaras achos ishto, because the pasuk of litzror appears only in the context of achos isha. So the Gemara says, Ma achos isha yuchedet she erva v'chayav al zdon akaris v'shigas achatas v'asur liyavim v'tzarasa asura of kol she erva v'chayav al zdon akaris v'shigas achatas v'asur liyavim tzarasa asura. Mikan Omru Chachamim, this is where we get the din of the Mishnah that Chamesh Esrei Nashim Potros Tzoraseim Tzoros Tzoraseim Mina Chalitza Mina Yibum Ad Sof Kol Ha'olam. And then the Gemara says one more. Yachol Shani Marba Af Sheish Arayos Kamuros Me'elu Shut Tzoraseim Asuros. Why we would have thought that even Shalom Makom Yibum, maybe this even, let's say there was the case of that I talked about last week. Let's say Pinchas, let's say Ruvain had a son-in-law named Pinchas, meaning he married his daughter to Pinchas. He's not his brother, just a regular fellow who's a son-in-law. And let's say Pinchas had another wife in addition to the daughter of Ruvain. He had two wives, and let's say Pinchas died. Is Ruvain allowed to marry the other wife of Pinchas? Meaning, can he marry the almana, the widow of his son-in-law, the other widow of his son-in-law? The answer is yes, he could. How do you know that? That's what the Gemara says. Maybe I would have thought that even in the other arayos that Soraseim are suros, Amris, Ma akos ishta miyuchedes she'erva v'chayavin al zona kares val shigas achatas ve'efshali nasa le'achim yasura liyavam v'tzarasa asura afkol shehi erva v'chayavin al zona kares val shigas achatas ve'efshali nasa li'achim yasura liyavam tzarasa asura yatsu sheish arayos kamuris me'elu hold yefshali nasa la'achim tzaraseim utaros shein sara elameach. That's what we're up to. So basically, the Gemara has established two things. Number one, that Achos, Ishto, and every other erva is excluded from Yibum. And number two, that even the tsaros, even the co-wives of these ervas are excluded. So now, there's one more line in the Gemara. And then we're going to stop in one more minute. So the Gemara says, how do you know that there's an onesh, which is the same onesh? Azara shamanu onesh minayin. How do we know that you get the punishment of kares even for tzara? Says the Gemara, Amar ki kol ish asher yaseh mikol hatoiva, etc. Okay, so now I just want to read one more line. This is where we're going to stop. So now the Gemara says, listen, you just spent time trying to prove that an erva is excluded from Yibum, and you thought you need a pasuk to teach you that. Isn't it, says the Gemara, why do you need a pasuk? The Gemara says the following. Tama de kasav rachmana aleha. The only reason that we concluded that the erva, like, for example, achos ishto or kalaso, right, are excluded from Yibum is because the Torah writes the word aleha. That's what we said above. Halav hachi, if it hadn't been for that source, havamina achos isha misyavemes, you would have thought that his wife's sister, who's also his, brother's wife, mean two brothers married sisters, right? Two brothers married sisters. So she's his double sister-in-law. She is the sister of his wife, and she's the wife of his brother. So you would have thought that she could be misyavemes. My time, because of the principle of asay dochalos asay, that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. Emer damrinan asay asay v'dochalos asay v'los asay greda. But los asay sheish bakares
doesn't apply by capital. Doesn't apply.
So the Gemara is asking if it's an asay sheyesh alav sheyesh bakares, we don't apply the rule of asay dochalos asay. It's too severe. So why do you need a source to teach you that erva, an additional erva is excluded from Yibum? It should be obvious. There's no basis for the heter. What would be the heter?
We don't know that Tzoras erva is chayav kares.
What?
We don't know that Tzoras erva is chayav kares.
Not Tzoras erva. We're talking about achos ishto. Erva, not Tzoras erva. Erva certainly chayav kares. So why do you need a source to teach you that erva is excluded from Yibum? It has to be excluded. The asay can't justify violating a lav shel kares. So I'm going to leave you with the Gemara at this point, and we're going to pick up with that next week, because that goes to the heart and core of the question. Is a regular yibum, the question you asked before, is a regular yibum also based on asay dochalos asay, or just a yibum with respect to an additional erva? Let's say the yibum of eshes ach, is that based on asay dochalos asay? So we're going to show next week that's an argument between the Balei Tosas and the Ramban and the Adrama. Very lively argument and very important. That's where we get to the issue of Hutra and Dechuya. Okay, so we're going to stop here. Everybody should have a great week.
Have a good week. Koch. Thank you,
look
Rabbi.
forward to
Thank you.
continuing next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Good night.
To ask you, Rabbi, are you still there? Or,
Yes, I am.
I wanted to ask you, it's more a personal one, but let's leave it. You know, when the book was distributed, I think I was away and I never received it. Is there a way I could get still the book, or shall I wait for the forum sale at YU and just get myself one? What shall I do?
Let me find. I don't know if I have any extras myself so much because I have copies for the family.
Sure.
But I'd be happy to. We'll make sure somehow.
Okay.
I think that in the shul, I think Andy Lowinger maybe.
Yeah, Andy donated it to the shul. I understand, but he
So
did
do
not.
they have extras?
I don't know. I have no idea.
I would ask the Rabbi
Look,
Babbage.
I read the book. I read the book and happy to give it to you. It was a brilliant book.
No.
I read the whole thing. I don't need it again. I'm happy
You
to
should
drop.
keep it. Listen, my friend. You should keep it because it's a treasure. So if it's a treasure, keep it. I'll get the book.
Okay.
Find
you very
find out from Rabbi Babbage if there are extras. If not, I'll make sure to get one.
Okay.
Rabbi, if you have a moment, what
Sure.
is the mechanism for Yevamos exactly? Do they go through Ketubah and to Eidim and Chuppah again?
We'll discuss that.
And
The ksuva of the previous husband, if there was one, is transferred to this marriage, if there was one. As for witnesses, you do need witnesses. The question, are they in the category of what we call Ede Kiyum or Ede Birur, meaning, so that's a big debate. And, the Rambam weighs in on the fourth chapter of Yibum. But we will discuss.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Yevamim is a fairly individual and private event, just as you outlined it right now. While Chalitza is very public indeed, and it labels the person with a permanent title as well, because he's got to go and to the
Bezdin.
To the Bezdin and actually do all of this becomes a very public event. Is that a significant difference as to if the person wishes only to do, not to do Yevum, but also not to do Chalitza? Where is he in that regard?
Well,
doesn't want to do Yevum for whatever reason,
right?
And doesn't want Chalitza because it doesn't want the public shame.
Right. So we have this.
It doesn't need a public shame.
Right. There's the first in the Chuvas of the Chacham Tzvi.
My grandfather, yeah.
The Chacham Tzvi was, that's right. You told me that. In Siman Aleph, the first Siman, he discusses the question, but he thinks that it depends on the woman. He says if the woman doesn't mind remaining in limbo, he has a case where somebody was a very old woman and she became subject to, she was married, her husband, they never had children, and, she's 100 years old now, and her husband dies. So she says, I don't need Yibum or Chalitza. So the Chacham Tzvi writes in the Tshuva that he thinks that, not everybody agrees with him, that there's no obligation. As long as she is not unhappy to be in limbo, and in this case, she's 100 years old, so she's not looking to remarry. She's not looking, to add a chapter. So he said the Chacham Tzvi's own view is that she could, opt, neither to do Yibum nor to do Chalitza.
And then
However,
finally,
certainly where she is going to remain in limbo, that's not a decision that we would allow him to make with impunity. So he would either have to do Yibum or he would have to go to the Bezdin. Again, it doesn't have to be such a public affair. I mean, I've been to Chalitza, just to see it. And, it's usually has the parties and the Dayanim. And if they ask them, because the Chalitza is relatively rare, sadly, given the war, I got a note from one of my students the other day who's, listens to some of the shiurim, and he said to me, it's tragic. He said the Masechta of Yibam, Yevamos, mostly in our world is theoretical. Like how many situations are there? And sadly, in this war, he said, he himself has friends. He knows a number of young women, Nebuch, who are newlyweds and whose husbands were killed already in battle. And it's tragic that this is a very real.
tragic indeed. Yes.
So it's. But I've been to some chalitzas in the rabbinical.
I've been to one.
Organization.
I've been to one. I saw it.
There aren't that many people there, but they sometimes ask the the Yavam and the Yavama, do they mind if if other people watch because it's rare and they want to train people, But if they say no, then they'll be sensitive to their needs, and there'll be only the three dayanim and the parties. So, but it would be wrong to leave the woman in limbo, when she has an option to go on.
Have children, yeah.
And finally, this concept that we covered today by Abu Shal as to the motivation, the inner motivation of an individual in committing a mitzvah.
Yeah.
That is fascinating. And how do you determine it? And where else in Torah does motivation in committing a mitzvah become scrutinized?
Right. That's why I think I said that it's on the first question, it's very hard to know. And that's why Abba Shaul, because of his view, didn't trust, people to be able to kind of, cultivate, that purity of motivation, which is why he said that he preferred that people do chalitza, even though Yibum is always better than chalitza if you can do it properly. But his confidence in the ability to do it properly was low enough that he felt as a policy that it's better to encourage chalitza for that reason. But, I guess the only person that would know that, is the person himself. And it's fine if you have multiple, if there are multiple motivations, but the point is that mostly it shouldn't be exclusively Yofi or Mammon or Ishus. It should be Lahakim La'achiv Shem. So that I think is number one. The second point is I totally agree with, and that is we do find, the need for intent and the need for even lishma in many things in the world of kadshim, but, to such an extent, like we are making this very subtle distinction, it's very rare. It's very rare. And I don't know anything, if it's Minat Torah, which is the view of the Rambam and the Ramban and many of the Rishonim, the idea that level of purity of motive is indispensable. I don't think you have any other example of it that quite so key. Yeah.
Many of the Mefarshim, if I may just make the additional point, find that the 10th commandment, Lo tachmod eshet recha, Lo tachmod bechlal, is the most difficult of all the Aseret HaDibrot.
Well, the Ibn Ezra, very famous comment on that, where he says, that Rabim Tamohu Alav, that, how can people control their, but you're right, it's a great example. Although his answer is fascinating too. And that is, he says, that if you cultivate, an attitude towards things in a very deep way, you really can shape your own thinking. And he gives the example of, he says, listen, if somebody was in a caste society, when he had a serf, and he said he wouldn't, unless there was something wrong with him, he wouldn't be obsessing, about marrying the princess because he knows it's not realistic. So people do are able usually to distinguish between things that are realistic and things that are fantastical or a fantasy. And what the Ibn Ezra says about Los Achmod, which is fascinating, is that if your commitment to Torah and to halacha is strong enough, then when something is off limits, then you'll feel like it's a fantasy. It's not a real. So I think I mentioned this in the past, but somebody mentioned to me years ago that that people who smoke, again, the Surgeon General has done a good job, so smoking is on the decline, hopefully, in a big way. But for people who really have the compulsion to smoke, Orthodox Jews, how do they give it up on Shabbos? Like, so somebody once said, because it's not an option for people who are serious, it's not an option to smoke on Shabbos. So, their sense of reality overrides, the compulsion. But any other day of the week, they can't stop themselves because it's
They cannot
permissible.
wait. They cannot wait for Motzei Shabbos for the first.
Right.
day.
So it's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, this idea of self-discipline or things being, there are transcendent truths, or realities that are greater than your own personal cravings or compulsions.
Yeah.
A very fascinating paradigm.
Rabbi, a quick question. I'm sorry to detain you.
That's
They,
okay.
when I was asked to sit in the as a dayan at the Chalitza in Johannesburg so many years
Wow.
ago.
Uh-huh.
So I was caught by the Mazgir of the Beth Din as I happened to walk through the Beth Din in Johannesburg. Said, we have a problem. I walked in and I saw Chalitza right away. Do have all the three dayanim, do they have to be expert, or is it enough that the Av Beth Din, who is a huge Talmud Chochem, and he was a huge Talmud Chochem, sufficient, and whatever, and the other two dayanim do whatever he tells them to do?
Right. Usually, it's preferable to have real, trained dayanim, but you could get away if you have to. I'm guessing in a place like Johannesburg. When was this? What year was this?
It was 1967, a long time ago.
Yeah.
Today you have plenty Rabbonim, Talmidei Chachamim, but in those years was a different.
Right. So they did what they could, and they had somebody who was expert who instructed the others, and they were, kosher the dayanim. But obviously, it's better.
Oh yeah, sure they were kosher. Sure.
Yeah. Okay, I've got to
Thank
run.
you very much.
Good to see you all, and to be continued.